They all thought it had an easy solution. On the outside, looking in, it was finished, explained, closed. Just the kind of case people move on with once their first round of curiosity is met. But what none of them knew then was it was the ending none of them would be able to leave with, because no one anticipated what was about to follow. Welcome to Darktown Archives, a look into the stories that are presumed to be finished until time reveals the truth that these stories were never fully understood to begin with. This is where it started, in a place that seemed predictable. This was a town that came with routine and familiarity that brought trust. This did not seem like it would be the kind of place where it would teach you about unexpected outcomes. When this situation came up, it seemed like it was going to be pretty run-of-the-mill. This seemed like it was what it should be, with its explanation and its reaction. At least, that is what they told themselves. Those are the early years of confidence. Confidence in authority. Confidence in the community at large. Confidence that the truth had been discovered speedily and that there was no need to do anything else. Confidence spread rapidly because of one potent thing: reassurance. People want closure, not complexity. This is how the case proceeded. Information was shared, findings were made, and then the town just moved on. The topic of conversation reverted to its usual theme. This incident went from being an active consideration to simply an experience in the rear-view mirror. On the surface level, all returned to normal. Just because I don't live in a certain neighborhood anymore doesn't mean I not immediately. Not loudly, just quietly enough to be ignored. At Darktown Archives, we've noticed that a lot of cases begin this way. Not with conflict, but acceptance. Not with pushback, but relief. When a result is acceptable, most people do not question it. And that's where problems begin. The years went by, and the case gradually slipped from the headlines, but not from public consciousness. Certain elements were retained in memory. Certain occurrences didn't quite fit together seamlessly. However, since the end result had long been accepted, these inconsistencies were ignored. They were considered irrelevant. Just minutiae that did not alter the larger picture. Except they did. Extra's vertical bar in this particular case. Nothing extraordinary happened in the investigation process. Rather, it is in how they were all so sure of themselves with regard to the ending. Nobody questioned the logic behind the final result, because they were all sure that this is how things were meant to happen, after something has happened. Going back is a prospect nobody relishes, because in order to question the result, you have to question the process. But to question the process is to imply there might have been something overlooked. The community avoided such awkwardness for a long time. Life moved on as usual. New patterns replaced previous discussions. The case became something that everyone mentioned quickly but didn't want to revisit. Avoidance doesn't eliminate ambiguity, rather, it puts it off. When, years later, the case was revisited, the reaction was not shock, it was confusion. How had they all missed this? What was the nature of the persuasive quality of the result that it seemed so true at the time, but so fragile now? The answer was not deception. It was not manipulation. It was expectation. Everyone expected the case to go in one way, and as soon as that expectation was fulfilled, no one ventured further. But reality is not always as expected. As we shall see in this story, what happened instead of what everyone expected was not something earth-shattering at first. It did not come with headlines and announcements. Instead, it came with a series of questions, with doubt, with a realization that perhaps the first finding was not the full truth. And once this realization sunk in, things obviously changed. This case would prove to be a wake-up call that would challenge many beliefs, uncover hidden facts, and leave a long-lasting impact on every individual associated with it. Not because of how it would start, but because of how it would end up, but rather how it didn't end as everyone expected. In the next part, we'll examine the original outcome that everyone accepted and why this solution seems so plausible at the time. The outcome announced at the time felt final, direct, and satisfying in a way that allowed people to breathe again. The tone from officials announced finality in a calm voice that made it clear the situation was understood. There were no alerts or urgencies suggesting this case needed further consideration. This case is closed, and that certainty was important for the town. The ending provided relief. There was no danger anymore. There was no unanswered threat. There was no need to be on guard. Life could go back to normal, and for most people, this was all they had wanted. The explanation meshed very cleanly with what they already thought about their town, where serious problems don't linger. As Darktown archives, it commonly becomes apparent how conclusions are accepted, not on their merit, but on their convenience. When an explanation fits what someone expects, it will not be met with resistance. That was exactly what happened. The specifics of the result were repeated over and over again until they became very familiar. Talk contained the same elements of discussion. The summaries of news highlighted not uncertainty but closure with time. The case ceased to be something that people analyzed, but rather something that people remembered. However, memory has a tendency to simplify things. Some elements of the story were highlighted while others faded quietly into the background. Timelines were compressed. Detailed situations were simplified to a few descriptions. The result not only solved the crime, but also recreated how it was perceived. And shaping and reshaping are powerful. As time went by, the town adjusted. Businesses opened fully, community activities resumed. Worrying among parents ceased. The case became a talking point in the past, and not a worry. It is something one would bring up and then forget. Yet beneath that acceptance, subtle doubts remained. Those doubts not enough to lead to arguments, just enough to keep wondering how some choices were arrived at so speedily, how some facts were left unexplained, how the ending felt so complete when some stories felt so incomplete. In my work at Darktown Archives, I've noticed that the dangerous consequences are often the ones that are too comfortable to confront. They're consequences that discourage exploration in any way. They imply that there's no point in being curious about them anymore. And when curiosity wanes, so does scrutiny. The consequence that was accepted by everybody actually did so. The consequence over time, it was never brought up in great detail. Occasionally, it would be mentioned, being talked about in historical terms, almost as if it was from another age altogether. The new people came to learn about it through a mere recount, devoid of complexity. They believed that its resolution was inevitable. Thus, slowly but surely, the case was settled, not on the facts but on repetition. However, results based on assumption aren't stable results. When I was a kid, she was saying, I knew what I wanted in a woman. What she wanted was a woman who could wrestle a bear naked and come out on top, or a woman who could wrestle a bear naked and get away before the bear noticed she was there, or a woman who could wrestle a bear naked and get away the changes in the town passed unnoticed by the people there. It was an unseen process. It took place in personal thoughts, and in casual talks, and in instances wherein one person took the time to think again, and understand that he or she did not know much after all. This awareness was quite unnerving. Because to accept an outcome is to accept the process which produced it. And to doubt the outcome is to doubt the validity of the process. For a long time, the town could avoid the awkwardness. It was easier to believe the answer than the uncertainty it reopened. However, avoiding the problem does not relieve doubts, but merely postpones them. But in this particular case, it was at a stage where doubt had stopped being ignored. In the next installment, we will explore the point at which the result was called into question for the first time, and how one small detail made everyone question everything they thought they knew. For a long time, nothing happened to it. Not because it was good enough to stand as is, and it certainly was not, but simply because no one thought it necessary to go back and take another look. The case was simply a footnote in a book that was never opened. To everyone but Rose and Jude, it was over. There was no sign of this until the small detail. It didn't arrive with a sense of urgency or fanfare. Rather, it sort of rose from the ashes in a passing read. Somebody read this case all over again, not with a purpose of disputing a result, but with a purpose of comprehending it. That is when something didn't smell quite right. At Darktown Archives, we have seen that turning points are rarely heralded. They emerge out of discomfort, from hesitation, from the sensation that something is not quite adding up in a story. The fact itself was not dramatic. It had been recorded early on in the case, glossed over briefly, then neatly pushed aside. There was no reason for it then. It didn't fit in with what was expected. Now, looking back at it through the lens of years, what could have been the reason for such a hasty dismissal of this? What could be the reason for it not having been explored? When the case was examined more closely, inconsistencies began to arise. Not necessarily obvious inconsistencies, just gaps. Places where time seemed to pass quickly, points where testimony was summarized rather than analyzed, choices made for reasons not clearly documented alone. Each of these presented no evidence to contradict the outcome, but collectively, it seemed to point to a frightening reality, that perhaps the case had already reached its end. While the questions were still unanswered, the awareness, however, did not generate any degree of certitude. It spawned a sense of doubt changes everything. As I write for Darktown Archives, I've often said that cases come undone not on the strength of new evidence, but on someone's willingness to look at old evidence with an expectationless gaze. That happened here. The more the original assumptions were removed, the less certain the outcome felt. That which once felt clear now felt hasty. That which once made sense now felt like it needed finishing. The confidence that surrounded the solution began to dissipate. Quietly at first, those involved in the review did not rush to declare what they found. They double-checked the facts, compared dates, searched for answers that might have been missed. The more they reviewed the situation, the more it became apparent that the initial decision was heavily weighted towards what they expected. Everyone knew that the case was going to develop in a particular way. And once this expectation was met, it says in the book, no one questioned it. Such realization was not only awkward for the detectives, but for the whole community. The reason was that questioning the verdict was tantamount to questioning the choices that culminated in the verdict. It meant that the closure might have been too early. As news of the review leaked, reactions were mixed. Some were relieved, some were uncomfortable, not because they were fearful of the truth, but because they were fearful of what a return to the past may discover about the present. The town had a foundation of peace based on the idea that the case was closed. It was unsettling to go against a feeling of closure. However, denying the feeling of doubt seemed dishonest. Thus, it entered a new chapter in the case, officially unreopened but opened in one's mind. People started to think in a different way, speak in a different way, view well-known details with fresh and foreign eyes. The ending that was so final suddenly turned uncertain. Faithus marked the point at which the story took a new turn. Asterisk, for once a case is doubted. It can never get back to the simplicity it once enjoyed before. The assurance is lost. In its stead, there emerges a reality far more intriguing, the possibility that the truth may not turn out as one has always presumed. What happens next will show how this doubt spread throughout town, and how people reacted when they discovered the outcome they had come to expect may not be the final outcome they were to receive. Once doubt crept into the story, it wouldn't stay hidden. It crept quietly through the town, altering the manner in which people discussed the case, and, in turn, their perception of it. A conclusion previously regarded as certain was no longer so, which was a rather disquieting experience. The town did not respond in anger. The town responded in reluctance. Middlesbrough paused in mid-sentence. People picked their words carefully. There were those who avoided the question altogether. There were those who asked about it in private. For so long, the status quo had provided a sense of peace within the town. To go further would mean to revert to times of uncertainty, and uncertainty equated to danger. In Darktown Archives, it has been observed that in reopening cases, it's often the hardest part in acknowledging new facts. It's acknowledging facts that were already known and accepted. This town had begun to learn that, but as word spread that the case did indeed seem to be being reopened, public reactions became divided. Some locals were relieved, says one resident. They had always had questions about the verdict, but hadn't dared to question it for all these years. Some felt offended, not because they thought the result was flawed, but because a possible mistake in a true statement felt like a statement of failure of judgment, a failure of trust, a failure of the processes they had put their faith in. A tight-knit community takes these confessions personally. The reaction of the local authorities was tentative. There were no loud claims, no sudden changes. All happened slowly and thoughtfully. The public reassurances continued, but they sounded different now, less assertive and more measured. The certainty that characterized the situation was replaced. And people noticed the case slowly came to light in unexpected ways. An offhand remark made in a neighborhood store, a quiet inquiry made in a public meeting, a reflection that had nothing to do with this case. Then everything. The end result that no one had ever expected was no longer simply a possibility. It was becoming reality. Well, I say finally, that was not exactly what I was hoping for. A snicker escapes me before I can catch it. These people, Darrell Jones' friends from police records and newspaper clippings, knew this woman as Kaya Parker. I try out the name on Grandma Helen. That's what happened in this case. People began to go back through their own memories where they were when the case first occurred, what they were told, what they believed, and slowly, they began to realize just how much of what they knew about the case was not evidence, but expectation. The ending was supposed to have been straightforward for the town. In other words, and most significantly, it got one as soon as it stopped. But that simplicity was no more. What was toughest wasn't realizing that a result could be in error. It was realizing that truth might never fully supplant it, that there might be no clear-cut resolution at the end of this review. This uncertainty loomed large. Some of the residents would have loved the case to be revisited in totality. Some would have preferred that it would just remain closed. The tension was not aired loudly. No, the silent presence was there in their daily lives. It is the moment when the town realized the crucial point that, even if the result had changed, it is not possible to reverse what is already past. The awareness readied nothing inside me, it coalesced responsibilities. Obligation to recognize what was overlooked. Obligation to question what's to come with more curiosity. Obligation to realize there may not always be closure. As the case progressed into its final stages, one aspect became clear. Whatever might come to light, the truth would not bring back the sense of clarity that the town had lost. There was no expected outcome in sight. Note that the replacement that came about was much more complex. In the final section, we'll examine how the story finally landed not on the ending that everyone expected, but on the message that nobody saw coming. Eventually, the end came, but without understanding or fanfare. There wasn't an earth-shattering revelation that simply altered all that existed in an instant. A defining point in time in which the truth subsisted in its entirety and its legitimacy could no longer be contested. Rather, it came with something much harder to come to terms with, an end based on understanding rather than on irrevocable facts. Nobody could have expected that the experience did not end as people had envisioned. The original result could no longer be believed. And while new issues did not reveal a straightforward new result either, what was left with the town was not a new result, but a new understanding of how easily the mind can be led to believe. At Darktown Archives, we regularly state, the most frightening discoveries are perhaps not the ones we are surprised by, but the ones which cause us to query what we thought to be true in the first place. This is one such case. The review has confirmed that indeed the initial conclusion was arrived at hastily, not out of deceit, but out of confidence. Confidence that seemed justified at that time. Confidence that matched what everyone wanted to hear. But when that confidence was taken away, what was left was a case that was sketchy and weak, and still unsolved. For the town, it was a wake-up call. People had to come to terms with the idea that the ending that had been trusted all along may never have been the right ending in the first place. This was a conclusion that had been assumed rather than achieved. Time had left its mark. There was not much evidence available. Memories had faded away. The chance to ask better questions was over. The town was not left with justice as usual, it was left with accountability. Responsibility for the fact that reassurance had so easily taken the place of inquiry. Accountability for how the expectation overwhelmed the curiosity. Taking responsibility for silence when it had been equated with solution. This accountability also brought a change in the community. The end conversations changed. Folks were more hesitant about accepting easy answers, more open to doubting explanations that felt too easy, more mindful that the most persuasive explanations aren't necessarily the most true. The case became a point of reference. not because of what has been resolved, but because of what has been learned. It taught that what happens is not the same as truth. It held that closure is deceptive. Asterisk, and in a famous speech, he declared, "God helps us if we help each other." He believed that this code could lead at Darktown archives. This is the reason why stories like this are important. It's not because they have happy endings, Faye, but because they show the interplay between human nature and that which is unknown. How communities behave when the unexpected occurs. How comprehension can be gained without answers. There was no provision in this case for the town's needs. However, it gave the town what it needed: awareness. An awareness that no answer can be accepted uncritically. No explanation can be accepted simply because it is reassuring. Justice is not merely a matter of answering questions. It is a matter of being willing to keep asking them. As this documentary has encouraged you to think about how results are achieved and why sometimes conclusions are never what we want, I invite you to subscribe to the Darktown Archives for other informative crime documentaries. If you find these stories to be of great importance and merit, like this video and share it with people who respect understanding over assumption. And sometimes, having the most outstanding result is not what most people anticipate. It's the one that changes the way in which we think.